I need to bring closure to certain things. So I'm going to move, the way I want to organize, I want to move fairly quickly, not quickly, but I want to cover a lot of material here in the first, say, 45 minutes or so, just kind of catching up and filling in some holes on some things we've missed. I want to give you a chance as a group to process the learning and really think about what insight have I gained, and how might I use this information? How might I use it individually? How might we use it collectively? And then I want to leave some time at the end if there's questions that you have regarding any specific applications or contexts like that. Kim and I were talking at the beginning here. Is I think I provided you a bibliography. So we provided you two documents. One was a copy of the slides, and two was about a 25-page little set of material I put together. I kind of cut and pasted a number of things together. I'm thinking, and I haven't had time to check, that there was a bibliography at the back of that. I'm going to check. If there's not, I'm going to send one to Kim, who will email it out to you. So you'll have a reference list. And I will probably highlight a number of things that I would just suggest if you want to do some further reading. Some of it's more technical, but some of it I think is a little more broadly based. And so I'll try to make that available to you. And then just as a fellow participate in the Grace community, I'm more than open to having people call me and chat regarding just various situations. It's a topic I happen to, I don't know what's wrong with me, but I actually love this topic. So I'm more than willing to chat with you about issues that may come up and questions you might have. So in our first session, we really talked about what is conflict and looked at our relationship to conflict, where we learned about conflict. In the second session, we took time kind of giving you some models for unpacking conflict, looking at the narratives in which our conflicts often surface, looking at the positions, issues, and interest as a way of giving us some frameworks for being curious about what conflict may be about. And as we began to talk about conflict, one thing we noticed is that in many cases, conflict as it's being presented is often not about what we think it's about. There's a presenting issue, and yet the presenting issue is often more representative of a deeper issue we need to deal with. So, I may be mediating a case where it's about violation of some contract or rule and regulation, or legal parameters, and yet the core of the conflict is many cases a breakdown in relationship between the parties, breakdown in communication, breakdown in trust. And so, really one of the things I've mentioned a number of times is that as you develop capacity for being with and engaging conflict, really building the capacity to be curious. Really, what is this? What's going on here? What am I making this situation mean? What else could it mean? What's going on? What do I maybe need to understand that I'm not understanding, which is often a question I'll even ask. So curiosity. We also talked about just being aware of your own relationship and response to conflict, developing, mindfulness, emotional intelligence, to be aware of where do I tend to go when I find myself interpreting a situation as being evidence of a conflict? When do I go on the defensive? When am I able to suspend judgment and bring back curiosity? So we really focused on those areas in our first couple sessions. Last week, I wanted to introduce you to just a framework for thinking about how to engage a conflict effectively. And you'll notice I'm using the term engagement. It's a term of practice that says I'm not necessarily engaging the conflict where we're going to resolve the conflict, because we may not resolve the conflict, but we'll better understand it and potentially reach agreements that allow us to continue to move forward in our relationship related to a number of issues. So last week we focused primarily most of our time in phase one, which was preparing to engage. Okay. Tonight I'm going to review that real quickly, and then we're going to go into a little bit about how do you convene the conversation. And when I say convene the conversation, how do you start the conversation? How do I sit down with you and invite us to enter into a space where we can have a challenging conversation about high stakes issues where we have differences of opinion, and how can we structure that conversation? Then we're going to move briefly into how do we move the conversation forward that will facilitate our increased shared learning or understanding about what the issues are. And then to the extent necessary, how do we take that learning and apply it into some sort of action? Do we need to make a decision? Do we need to implement some change? Is there something that needs to happen? In some cases, we have a conversation and going, that was great. I better understand the situation and there is no need for action. But in some cases, there is a need for action, something that needs to happen. So I want to just spend some time hitting the highlights on each of those. And in each of those cases, I want to begin focusing just briefly on the skills. I want to talk a little bit about just being a good listener. I also want to talk about how do you ask good questions? Because one of the fundamental tools you have for engaging a conversation and structuring a conversation is in the questions you ask. And in many ways, if you want to shift the structure of the conversation, then you change the question. And so questions are incredibly powerful. So I want to spend a little bit of time on that. So, and if you have your questions, feel free to throw them in the chat room, the chat box. I'll try to respond to those as we can, and I will stop at various times and open up for questions as necessary. And again, you'll have a chance to do some group engagement around some of these conversations. So preparation, I introduced this triangle last time, which says that when people come together to engage in a difficult conversation, to engage in a conversation of shared decision-making or problem solving, they're going to focus that, in order to achieve satisfaction with that conversation, we need to achieve sort of emotional or relational satisfaction, which means we need to have the conversation, hopefully in a way that's respectful, that acknowledges our differences of opinion, but provides a space where people can not necessarily be agreed with, but can be understood, and that understanding can be conveyed. It needs to be a process where people can share openly and respectfully, and we are hearing from key stakeholders. And finally, it needs to be a process where we are really addressing the issues, substantive satisfaction. So I really introduced this idea last time that if I'm going to enter into a difficult conversation with you where we're going to engage a challenge, I need to spend some time preparing for that conversation. And I need to prepare myself personally, by asking the question, who do I need to be in this conversation? Who do I want to be in this conversation? How do I want to engage this conversation? I introduced the notion last time, at integrity. How do I want to be in this conversation in alignment with my commitment, to you as another person, to the group I'm involved in, to the issues, to my commitments of being a fellow human being on this planet, engaging challenging situations. So how do I prepare myself personally to enter into the challenging conversation, committed to what I would call mutual purpose? In other words, trying to resolve it in a way that recognizes our common and divergent interests, and in a way that's mutually respectful. So really preparing myself to come into the conversation, committed to be in alignment with core commitments and values that I have and that we may have as an organization around the conversation. We talked about substantive preparation. And substantive preparation isn't really focused on me. It's really focusing on what are we here to engage? What are the issues? How are we framing the issues that we're trying to address? What is the conflict? What is the challenge? What is the problem, whatever term you want to use, descriptor you want to use, that we're trying to address here? And this is an important question. Framing the issue is a significant factor. As a mediator, often, one of my jobs is how do we frame the issue such that we can even talk about the issue? How can we identify language that we can agree on? And I need to talk about why you're such a jerk. That's really not a great way to frame the conversation. Not going to be very helpful. Versus, I want to talk to you about our relationship and how we work together as colleagues or whatever that might be. And so framing the issue, identifying the question, identifying in many cases, not just the problem, but what's the outcome that you're trying to achieve. Substantive preparation involves what are the assumptions that I'm bringing into this conversation about you, about the issues, about the context. What is my narrative that's informing how I'm coming into this conversation? What are my interests as I'm going into this conversation to address an issue? What's important to me about that issue? What do I want to communicate to you about this issue that's important to me? And what am I hunching is important to you? Where do we have common objectives, common interests? Where maybe we have separate perspectives? And so I'm not thinking about this in advance, so I'm going in with a clear understanding. I'm preparing myself and just saying, First of all, what do I want out of this conversation? And then I'm hunching. I'm not saying, oh, I know what you want. I'm hunching. I'm thinking that, based on my understanding, what may be important to this other person might be these things. I'm not sure, but I'm going to go in with some curiosity to figure that out. Is there some information that we need that will facilitate a more, what's the word I want to use? Informed conversation. So if we're having a conversation about a policy or a procedure or a rule or some document or something, do we need to look at that material ahead of time? Do we need to review what it says before we begin arguing about it or discussing it? Okay. What are some options that I think might be possible for resolving this issue? I'm not committed to them totally, but I'm thinking, hey, so part of my preparation going again into conversation, I'm preparing myself personally, and I'm preparing myself substantively around the issues. And a lot of my preparation is so I can be really clear in what I need to understand about myself. So fundamentally, when I come into the conversation with you, I know what's important to me. I can focus my attention on what's important to you. I'm not focusing on what I need to tell you. It's what am I going to learn from you? And so, preparing yourself to come in with that kind of conversation. And then the last piece of preparation is just thinking logistically. Where should we meet? That's an important question. We're gonna, if it's in a professional context, are we gonna meet in my office, your office? If it's a personal context, are we gonna meet at your house or my house? Are we gonna meet at a coffee shop? I mean, those are simple questions, but they are important questions because what we're fundamentally focusing on is where can we create a space and identify a space where we can safely and productively have this conversation, where we won't be interrupted, where we're not feeling like we're in a fishbowl being watched by everybody else, where there is privacy, where there can be confidentiality, where if there's going to potentially be tears, which I've been in a lot of conversations with tears and sometimes they're mine, can those tears be expressed? Can that happen? Can we be open to the emotions that may be showing up in the conversation? And then, finally, I mentioned last time that sometimes preparation for a conversation is having a conversation about how we're going to have the conversation before we have the conversation in anticipation of the conversation. So, there are times, there's a lot of times I will spend times with groups saying, let's not have the conversation. Let's talk about how we're going to have the conversation and create the expectations about what and how we're here to, what we're going to address and how we're going to address it before we dive in. So that's a stream of words coming at you sort of from the proverbial fire hose. But before I move on to our second phase, I just want to see, are there any questions? And if there are, feel free to just unmute and put them out there if you'd like to. But any questions on this idea of preparing for the conversation? Does it make sense? Yep. And just as an aside, many of you are aware that coaching has become quite the context for supporting people. The whole profession of coaching has emerged in a significant way. And in the field of conflict engagement, a sub profession of coaches is conflict coaching. I often train HR folks to coach people within the department in certain divisions on how to navigate and engage conflict effectively. So really coming alongside someone and partnering with them to actually think strategically through these questions. Okay, so just putting that out there as a role that's emerging as the field of conflict engagement and coaching have grown in importance, particularly within organizational contexts. That's a role that's evolving. So now we want to move to phase 2, which is convening the conversation. And this is just simply, we need to start the conversation, okay? And I want to cover a couple different things here, but basically the goal that you want to address in the convening of the conversation, the number one objective you want to focus on is I want to create a safe space for us to have this conversation. I mentioned the book Crucial Conversations, and the authors use the metaphor of leverage, and they say if you want to apply leverage at some point in the conversation where it's going to have the greatest impact in shifting that conversation, You want to focus your leverage. You want to focus your influence on making it safe, okay? Because the number one reason people tend to avoid conflict and avoid difficult conversations is they don't feel safe, okay? And so if that's the case, we got to create safety immediately, which means, it could be said that what you say in the first 15 seconds of the conversation and how you say it can be critical. And there's two things you want to communicate when you are initiating this conversation. And again, this is based on the work of the authors of Crucial Conversations. One, they would say, is you need to communicate a commitment to what they call mutual purpose, which sounds something like this. In having this conversation with you, I want to be really clear. This is not, and I'm going to use a little technique here. It's called contrasting. It is not my objective to argue with you, to debate with you, to determine who's right or wrong about this issue. It is my objective. I am committed to slowing down enough for you and I to more deeply understand each other's perspectives on this issue, to identify where we have agreements, where we may have disagreements, where we may have uncertainty. And my goal is an outcome that works well for both of us. That's called mutually beneficial. That works well for both of us. That's my commitment. Now you got to commit that, you got to communicate that up front, because people are in many cases coming in on the defensive, ready to defend their point of view from what they perceive is going to be an attack. Why? Because that's what they usually get. And so you're going to come in and you're going to be proactive in sort of dismissing or taking away that by saying, that's not why I'm here. I'm not here to argue. I'm not here to debate. I'm not here about right or wrong. I'm here to figure out how we address this. Now you got to communicate that. And then going back to what I said last time, you got to operate at integrity with that. Because if you say that and then you start arguing and debating, it's like, whoa, time out. That's not what I thought this was about. You have to be ready to engage in that way. So you have to communicate a commitment to mutual purpose. And secondly, you have to communicate some commitment to sort of mutual respect and trust, and just say, and this may look like, I might acknowledge in the past, you and I have really struggled with this conversation. In fact, this conversation has been really hard for both of us, okay? My commitment in this conversation, in addition to us reaching an outcome that works well for both of us, is I really want to have a conversation that is mutually respectful, that feels safe, where we can really share openly and honestly and respectfully our diverse points of view, okay? So we can talk even a little bit about that. We could say, so, what could we do? And I might even say, what could I do that would support that? How might I be helpful? And I think I may have shared this last time, but what could I do that would help you feel safer and more able to engage in this conversation? And I would ask and I would respond. And I might ask myself, there's some things that you could do that would help me to be more engaged in this conversation. So in essence, we're beginning to set some parameters around expectations. Expectation is mutual purpose. Our goal is to address this issue. Our purpose is to resolve it in a way that both of us can find acceptable. Two, we're creating some expectations about how we're going to have the conversation. We want to have it respectfully. And what that looks like is this. Tell me what that looks like for you. Because respectfully is a broad construct. We have to say, okay, how do you and I operationalize that for us? What does that look like for us, okay? How can I be respectful of your point of view? How can you be respectful of my point of view? Once we share those parameters, then we share information with each other. And basically, I use a metaphor. I said, we empty our pockets on the table. I have this vision that when we come to the conversation, we got a bunch of stuff in our pockets. And I'm not sure it's because I'm a Tolkien fan, but we got stuff in our pockets. And basically, I'm going to say, let's empty our pockets and put on the table what it is we're here to talk about. So basically, we're going to take turns sharing from each other's perspective what we see as the issue, not to argue and debate it, but just say, so I might ask, Liz, what from your perspective, what is the issue that you're hoping we're going to address here? What do you see? How would you frame the issue that we need to address? And she would share that with me, and I would say, so let me make sure I'm understanding that, okay? And then I would share my perspective. Well, yeah, I agree with that. That's part of and here's some other pieces. This is what I'm bringing. I'm putting my pockets on the table. And so at the end of that conversation, we would basically look at what's on the table and would say, gosh, we just put a bunch of stuff on the table. Let's sort it out. Let's let's take a look at what we've put on the table as what we want to talk about, and let's just sort it into some categories. And so I'm a very visual person. We got a couple combs and some lint and some loose change and a couple nails from my pocket and a bunch of stuff like that. And say, well, let's sort it out. And so in sorting it out, we might say, as I was listening to what we put on the table, it sounds like one of the things that we need to talk about is how we communicate with each other. Yeah. So let's agree that we're going to talk about communication. And it sounds like, maybe one of the other issues that we need to talk about is, and this is one that's on my plate right now, our understanding of what mom's needs are. So my siblings and I are dealing with aging parents. And so it sounds like we've got some really different understandings of what mom's capabilities are right now, where her challenges are. Maybe we should just spend some time clarifying our understanding of, sort of what mom's needs are at this point in her life, okay? Yeah, and it maybe sounds like there's some questions. I had this conversation with someone recently about decision making, we got to make some decisions about some things going on here. And we really seem to be operating with some different understandings about what that looks like. So you see what we're doing, we're taking and we're sort of sorting what's on the table into some categories. Now, as a mediator, we call that setting the agenda. Mediator says, okay, you guys have come to mediation, you've emptied your pockets on the table as far as what are the issues you want to negotiate. Let's sort those issues into some categories that will facilitate a deeper, better understanding of those issues. So we can unpack them more fully. And so basically, it's just an initial sort that will support a more thorough and comprehensive exploration of the issues that are on the table. And then we really agree to move forward. It's really not, we're not here to argue about what's on the table. We're not here to argue about the past about what's on the table. We really want to shift the conversation to understand what's on the table, so to speak, in a way that's going to support us moving forward. That's the transition we want to make. So again, let me just stop there. I feel like I'm, again, sort of fire hosing you here, and I apologize. Questions on what's happening in this phase of the conversation as we're initiating, I use the term convening the conversation, what we're trying to accomplish.
Greg, I see that what you're saying is very reasonable if you're dealing with an adult to adult conversation. But quite often there's a lot of aggression that one is facing. And how do you overcome when someone is coming on as an attack and they don't want to listen? They want to have a catharsis, they want to unload, and they don't want to be reasonable and listen to what and come to an agreement. They just want to vent.
So John, there's a couple of ways I'd respond to that. One, if they need to vent, in many cases, I'll say, fine, I'm going to create a space for you to vent. Yeah. And I've developed, my sense is I need to sort of, thicken my skin up and say, I'm going to need to listen to some things about which I may just totally not agree and I don't really want to hear. However, I need to hear them. I do need to hear them. And this person's probably not going to hear a lot of what I have to say if I'm not willing to hear what they have to say. So I'm going to hear it. And I'm going to really listen. I'm going to be really focused on what do you need me to understand? And if you share it with me in a somewhat adversarial sort of way, I can live with that. And I like to say I can dance around the flame and not get burned. And there's a point where it moves from being angry to being abusive, I think. And I think we all have different levels of that. I tend to have a fairly high tolerance for that. But there's a point where I'm going, we're crossing a line here. This is I'm not sure I can stay in this conversation. For example, I had one person where every other word was the F word. I said, that's not working for me. We're not going to go down that path. So I'm going to listen to you with the goal of having you be heard and know you're heard. And really say, he needs to be heard. And I need to understand, whether I agree with it, I need to understand because I want to understand. So I'm going to model that. Now, at the end of that time, and that may take some time on my part, I'm going to ask you, do I understand what you need me to understand? And if you go, yeah, actually, I think you do, then I'm going to ask you, would you be willing to hear my perspective? And in sharing my perspective, it is not my objective to argue, negate, rebut what you've said. But would you be willing to allow me to add my perspective to yours in order to go forward? Now, my experience is, a high percentage of the time you'll go, yeah, I think so. If in fact I've been genuine in acknowledging your point of view. If you say, no, I really don't care what you have to say, I'm probably going to disengage from the conversation and pursue some other option. I mean, if you're not willing to work with me or to collaborate in some way to engage this, I may say, okay, then I may be sure I'm not going to have the conversation. And I may not, and I introduced the notion of a BATNA last week, which says I may have to pursue some other option for addressing this issue. That may not be in my bet. I may not want to do that. You may not want to do that, but that may be the way we have to go. In fact, there's an idea of what's called strategic escalation. I may actually heat the conflict up in order to bring you back to the table. So there's an idea of actually using strategic escalation to say, oh, maybe we need to, and I've seen this happen a lot of times where, oh, maybe I'm ready to talk now. Great, let's sit down and talk. So it's John, I think, right? Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, John, right. So does that answer your question at all?
Yeah, I think one thing we need to do is I need to take a deep breath before engaging in some of this.
Well, hey, John, that whole preparation phase is a whole number of deep breaths. Because that's where you're going to decide, how am I going to go into this conversation at integrity, willing to hear and even acknowledge, I don't have to affirm, but acknowledge what I need to understand and recognize that in some ways, and I don't know if I like this term, but I'm going to earn a hearing by listening first. I got to model that. And if I'm willing to model that, and what all of my experience and research tells me, I will begin to diffuse the other person's aggressiveness and resistance. Because I'm not resisting, I'm going with them to better understand. And that's something that they're not used to. They're not anticipating that. In Aikido, it's actually a martial arts move. You don't confront, you go with, and then you redirect. So.
Okay.
Thanks for the question. Other questions on where we are at this point?
I have a segue question from John's. In creating the context, you said safety is paramount and that there's some kinds of agreements you make to be able to begin to engage, to talk.
Yep.
But then when you're talking about, every other word was the F word, or allowing people to vent, I think it might be beyond what I know how to cope with, because I would be able to say, well, let's no name calling, or some limits about how people express themselves. So that's and when does that come into this process of convening? When do you set the rules for engagement?
Yeah, I would say that's really part of creating the context. So first of all, the example I gave, that's an extreme example. It did happen.
Yeah.
So I think in creating the context, you're going to say, we're committed to mutual purpose, mutual respect. What does that look like? Let's articulate that so that we can agree on and begin to operationalize what that looks like, to hold ourselves accountable for that. Okay. So you really want to set that up front. And it's not something that you're going to impose. You're going to say, let's you and I set that up. The other piece, and we didn't go into this, but as the conversation unfolds, and this is one of my actually favorite skills from the book, Crucial Conversations, they say is that as you're having the conversation, so once you set those expectations up, as you have the conversation, you in essence need to have your finger on the pulse of safety. You need to be monitoring the sense of safety in the conversation at all the time. And you need to be, the term that they use, they have that chapter in the book is called learn to look. You need to be sensitive to and learn to look for when safety becomes compromised. When at some point in the conversation, it moved from feeling safe to going, woo, this is not feeling this, as safe as it was a moment ago. Now, how do you know that? Well, sometimes you just get it at a visceral level. Sometimes you intuit it from an expression on someone's face, their body language, and things like that. And so the term is that when you are aware that safety has become compromised, you in essence stop the conversation at that point in time. You don't wait. You stop the conversation and you step, the term is you step out of the content of the conversation into the context of the conversation. And it may look like this, can we just stop for a moment? I just want to take a break. I noticed a moment ago that when I said such and such, the response on your face indicates to me that maybe that didn't land the way I intended. Can you tell me what's going on? Well, it feels like you just called me an idiot. Oh, okay. I may not have used the word idiot, but what I said may have been inferred that way. So what's happened in essence, without being aware of it, I made a little mess. And so the idea is rather than leaving that mess on the floor for us to slip up on and leaving that mess to get bigger, we're going to clean the mess up and say, whoa, that was not my intent. It was not my intent to in any way, shape, or form convey to you that I think you're an idiot. It was my intent to say that I think there are some things that need to be considered that weren't considered sufficiently in this, and I'd like to talk about that. See what I'm saying? So what we do is we identify that breakdown in safety, we stop, address it, clean it up, and then move on, okay? And I can't remember who was asking the question about that, but I'm not sure if that's helpful or
Carol
makes
did.
sense.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Okay. It's a great little skill. I love it, the idea of just saying, ooh, let's take a time out. Okay.
There's a question in the chat, Greg, which actually is kind of interesting.
Oh, great. Thank you. Is that, yeah, let me take a look at that. Oh my goodness, yes.
Greg, that's my question. And, speaking, so I'll just speak for myself as a woman when I've had male bosses or male colleagues, that this certainly comes into play. And I'm wondering, I'm sure you encounter that all the time in your work. I'm wondering what you have to say about that, the power differential thing.
Yeah, and this came up in the first session too, the question about power. And to be really honest with you, I go back and forth on how much to bring into a session because it's a huge topic. And when you talk about power, we often talk about who has it and who doesn't. Everybody has it, everybody uses it, and it's different in all situations. And so, to talk about it as a sort of a singular notion is a challenge, but, people have, power of position, power of information, power of who they know, power of what they can articulate, power of resources, and power, I found power dynamics are changing often. And so, yeah, it's a significant issue. And Kim, the situation that you identify where there's a power differential, for example, in an organizational structure where you're, power differential between yourself and a supervisor or boss, yeah, that becomes a difficult situation. I happen to think there's a whole lot of work to be done among leaders in how to model appropriate conflict engagement and in leadership. And I think the ability to be with and engage conflict is a incredibly significant leadership capacity, which is often missing from organizations and structures. And so I think that in many cases, in the situations that you're talking about, when I'm working in organizations or teams, that there's really value in saying, I'm just curious as a team, and this can be when you join the team for the first time, or if a team's forming for the first time and saying, we're going to experience conflict. It's going to happen. So before it happens, let's talk about how we're going to navigate that. You need to be proactive, really create some expectations and systems for how we're going to navigate the inevitable conflict that shows up. And that can be in a family, that can be in a partnership, that can be in a workplace situation, it can be with two colleagues working on a project. But we don't wait till the conflict shows up and then sort of go to our baser behaviors. Like, no, we know it's going to show up. and let's plan and agree in advance how we're going to engage that in an effective way and how we're going to hold ourselves accountable. So in essence, I think in addressing some of those power differentials where it's going to maybe be a problem down the road, I think we need to have those conversations up front about how we're going to navigate those. And if I'm a leader and I have power in the situation, I think I need to be pretty transparent on how I'm going to use that power, and hopefully using that power in service of us as a group, but in a way that maintains safety and respect for us as a group as we go forward.
That's
Kim,
great.
I'm not sure if that even begins to answer the question, but
No, it's a huge issue. And one thing that's been really encouraging to me is the way that people will vocalize their privilege before entering into a conversation like that. I think it's full. Thanks, Greg.
well, I think one of the things I've always thought, you have the power to get what you want. People also have the power to keep people from getting what they want. And so we always assume the people who have the power to get what they want have all the power, and going, not necessarily. A lot of people have power to achieve objectives in different ways. So I'm just saying is that it's an incredibly complex notion that is often changing over time among people and how it manifests itself. And my goal in working with conflict is how do we use our power, hopefully, particularly in relationships, in service of wise decisions for us in that relationship. Because people are going to use power. And power is not a bad thing. Power is what it is. It's how do we choose to use that power in service of our mutual purpose and the focus of the relationship. And I think we need to talk about that before we get in the situation where it becomes an issue, so we can then again have agreed on how we're going to navigate these challenges at integrity in this relationship. How are we going to use our power at integrity with commitments we've made to each other in the situation? So I hope that's helpful. And if you want some readings on that particular notion, I'd be more than happy to share some of that. So I talked a little bit about, in this first phase of the convening conversation, that we are really going to be practicing good listening. And I was sharing with John, he said, I need to spend time listening. And so, the skill that's often out there that's, predominant in all of communication, but particularly in the area of conflict engagement, dispute resolution, and negotiation, is the art and skill of active listening. And my hunch is that many of you in some professional context have been introduced to the notion of active listening and what it is. And it's funny, whenever I'm teaching active listening, sometimes someone will say, oh yeah, active listening. I hate it when people do that to me. I don't know if you've ever had active listening done to you, but I know I have, where, and what I want to really focus on is there's active listening, there's doing active listening, and there's being an active listener. And they're two very different things, okay? You can teach people to do active listening as a technical skill where you can actually observe certain behaviors. This is what you say, this is how you say it. Active listening is more about truly being an active listener in service of increasing our deeper shared understanding about an issue. So active listening is often described in this sort of diagrammatic way. As you can see on the screen here, you've got a speaker on the left and a listener on the right. And we say the speaker wants to convey something to the listener, okay? So I'm the speaker over here, and I've got some information that I want to convey to you over here as the listener. And how do I get that information to you? Well, what we sometimes say, we use the term, well, I as the speaker, I have intent of what I want to share, and I have to encode that intent. I have to encode that idea, that information I want to share with you. Now, how do I encode it? Well, first of all, I'm going to encode it using language. I'm going to say, what's the language I can use to share what I want to share with you? And then I'm going to be more nuanced. As I share that language with you, I will use body language, nonverbal behavior, and I share that word with you. And I'll also use intonation. And if you look at the research out there, this has been around for a long time. There's research that says communication consists of three elements: words, nonverbal behavior, and intonation. and I don't know who did the research, it's been around for years and I can't remember who did it, but they said, okay, so what percentage of communication is the words? Well, if you read the literature, it's 8%. Only 8% of my message is in the words that I choose to use. 37% of the message I convey to you is in the intonation that I use with those words, and a full 55% is nonverbal behavior. So when we're listening, we're not just listening to words. We got to be present as this listener to the words and how the words are being conveyed that are coming across, because the message is embedded in that. You know, I understood this intellectually for years, and then I had to do a mediation once on a conference call. This was a long time ago, before Zoom. And all of a sudden I realized for the first time, 55% of what I rely on for communication was gone. Because all I'm getting is a voice and the intonation. I'm getting no visual. And even now, as we're doing mediation in a virtual context, mediators it's hard to do when you're not able to be present to that communication. So I encode the message and I convey the message to you verbally and non-verbally, and you got to decode the message. You have to interpret the language. You have to interpret the words, the intonation, and you interpret and you get a message. So the question in communication always is, how do we know if what I intended to communicate is in fact what you interpreted? And the way that we do that is through a process called active listening, which is a feedback process where I, as the listener, feed back to you what I heard, what I understood, in service of confirming the message being received accurately, okay? So that's what it looks like. Again, active listening, again, is as much about being an active listener as doing an active listening. Quick story, I was doing a mediation years ago, and it was one of those mediations that, I don't know, at the end of the mediation, I was really pumped. It was like, that was so much fun. That was such a great mediation. We got such a great outcome. We have a great agreement. We worked out the relationships. And I was like, I was in the zone as a mediator. And in my mind, I'm thinking, man, I am God's gift to communication. So I was feeling pretty good. So I got in my car and drove home. And this was a number of years ago. And my wife, Kathleen, meets me at the door. The kids were much younger today. She had not had as good a day as I'd had. And so she began sharing with me very quickly her day. And I began, without thinking about it, doing active listening, not being an active listener. I basically showed up at the door as Greg, God's gift to communication, Mr. Mediator, and listening to her from that place. And the first words out of her mouth were, "Don't you mediate me." And I immediately got it. Was what I was doing bad? No, but it was totally disingenuous. I was not being Greg husband. I was doing Greg, professional mediator, and it came across that way. So you can see on the slide there, reasons for active listening. People want to be heard, and telling somebody, "Oh, I hear where you're coming from," is not sufficient. What I hear you telling me is, what's important to you is, what I sense you're feeling is, you want to be able to feed that back. Again, it's that feedback process. As I'm actively listening to you, I'm actually helping you think more clearly. Because as I reflect back to you what you said, and you hear it from me in my voice, in my words, you're going, yeah, that is what I said, but that's not quite what I meant. So I'm helping you to begin to sort out and clarify and really become more nuanced in what you're communicating. It diffuses emotion. Again, as I was talking to John, as I listen to you, I diffuse your aggressiveness. As I diffuse your aggressiveness, I increase the likelihood that you're going to be willing to engage in a conversation with me. So active listening, I don't have time to demonstrate it right now, but sufficiently to say that it's responding back the substance of what the person said, reflecting the emotion of what they said, summarizing a lot of what they said in service of facilitating our ongoing communication. So let me stop there. And again, just see, are there questions about active listening? I'm reading just some of the comments in the chat box. What about people who stonewall and avoid engagement? I think we talked about that. Is that why Zoom makes things more complicated? Absolutely. People in a Zoom meeting do not have the same level of engagement and presence as we have face to face. So, and it's again true in written communication. That's why I guess why they designed emojis to try to increase our communication in a written form. Questions on the idea of active listening, the importance of it or what it looks like? Active listening is essential to being present, okay? Active listening, in essence, presences me to your conversation. It actually, there's a book by Peter Senge and Joe Jaworski and a bunch of other guys who out of that whole world of learning organizations that talk about being so present in a conversation with somebody, so engaged that it's as if the conversation is a mechanism that has connected our thinking. We are, and I've experienced this in a small number of cases, but when we are so present in the conversation, you and I are not necessarily thinking as individuals. We've moved from you and me to actually thinking as a we. Now, that's a much deeper application of this, and yet there's a fascinating, lots being written about just a whole sort of spiritual connection of being present with. I've had the opportunity to participate in the discernment training ministry at Grace, and there is a spiritual dimension, and Judy, I think, has been part of this. There's a spiritual connection of being present in someone with a conversation for 2 to 3 hours that just links you in this spiritual way. I was at a professional conference for mediators, and one of the sessions that was being offered was the spirituality of mediation. I go, oh, that sounds interesting. I kind of go and see what that's about. And there was like 70 people in this room talking about this dimension to being engaged in that level of conversation that's operating at a spiritual level that's and beyond our understanding, but everybody could allude to and identify this presence that became possible in that connection. So I want to move it from being just sort of a technical skill to it's a way of being when you're with somebody in conversation, of truly being present. Okay, when we move into the third phase of our conversation, we are really now taking what we've put on the table and we're taking time to explore it. So we're going to begin to ask questions, and we're going to have a deeper conversation. We're not looking at what's on the table and saying, okay, what's on the table is decision-making and communication. How are we going to fix communication and decision-making? No. Let's talk about communication. Let's unpack that. What does that mean to you? Where does that show up as being a challenge? What works for you in communication? We're going to have a conversation to really a deeper dive into that, into decision-making, whatever issues might be. And so this is really where in a negotiation, this is where we're really unpacking the issues that we're trying to negotiate in just a difficult, challenging conversation. We're deepening, I think I use the metaphor, we're deepening our shared pool of understanding of the issues we're talking about. In some cases, just to deepen our understanding. That's all we're here to do. In some cases, we're trying to deepen our understanding so that we can make some decisions that will be better informed based on that deeper understanding. Now, the tool that we're primarily using in this phase of the conversation is we're really asking good questions, okay? And this is where, gosh, we could spend a whole day just on this one slide practicing this. But all I want to say is that in dealing with conflict and dealing with difficult conversations, I would say, active listening is important, but I would say one of the most important skills you have is in the questions you ask. The conversations we have are determined by the questions we ask. If you want to change the conversation, you change the question. They're incredibly powerful. You know, I really see questions are tools, you know, in my toolbox of that I have to facilitate the conversation. And so I just want to introduce you to, when we've talked about active listening, I want to introduce you to sort of a basic toolbox of questions that I think are particularly useful when we're engaging difficult, challenging conversations, where we're trying to achieve deeper shared understanding, where we're working towards mutual purpose. We're not focusing on debate. We're not focusing on who's right or who's wrong. And so when I'm teaching in this context, this is what I just sort of call my basic toolbox of 7 types of questions. You know, these are not 7 questions, they are 7 types of questions. And so, you know, when I'm using the tool metaphor, I think very literally. You know, I don't have a single screwdriver, I have a whole box of screwdrivers. I don't have a single wrench, I got a whole box of wrenches, and I got a whole box of hammers. And I mean, so we have different tools for different functions, okay? So I just want to go through this, and I will let you know that the material that I provided for you in this class has has a lot of what we're going to be talking in the notes and more detail on this particular topic, okay? I will say a book I read a couple of years ago was interesting. It's called A More Beautiful Question by a guy named Warren Berger. And his basic premise is that as a society, as a culture, as organizations, we've lost the art of asking questions. We are much more reinforced for solutions to problems than questions about problems. And most people are reinforced for solutions, not questions. Questions are often seen as a distraction. And yet in the world in which we're operating, where the complex, what we refer to as adaptive challenges that we face that require new learning, they require the ability to ask questions. And so there is a resurgence among a number of people in really coming back to, how do we ask questions that facilitate deeper learning, that are not seen as distractions? And there's just some fascinating examples out there of organizations that are coming back to this notion of reinforcing this idea of shared learning around the more complex work we're dealing with. So looking at these 7 questions, the first type of question that we often will ask in a conversation is called a broadening question. And a broadening question is designed to be very non-threatening, very broad in the type of response options. Okay, so when you're asking a broadening question, you're being very non-directive, and you're giving the person to whom you're asking the question a lot of latitude in where they're going to go. So if, let's just say you and I were working together, and one of the issues that we need to talk about is our communication, okay? So I might start in just saying, so when you talk about communication, tell me what you think about. What comes to mind for you in that category? What's included in that topic? That's a real broad question. It's not like, how do you fix communication, or how can I become a better communicator? It's like, what's included in that? Or just a simple question like, tell me more about what happened. What happened next? You know, as you understand the situation. So for example, I don't know why this is on my mind, but it's because where a number of my conversations are right now with my siblings. Tell me about what you're seeing in mom right now and what her needs might be. You know, so we're coming together. My mom's in her 90s, and my sisters and I are, you know, trying to figure out how do we support effectively. And so, you know, when we get together, I often say, who saw mom last? What did you see? What's going on? You know, what would be helpful for the rest of us to understand? So those are broadening questions. Clarifying questions, man, so important. I ask these all the time. Clarifying questions are designed to clarify a word, a term, a construct that may be unclear. So if someone says, I'm really concerned about the safety in that situation, I'm really concerned about the kid's safety, or maybe we're talking about mom, I'm really concerned about mom's safety right now. Well, what's a clarifying question you want to ask? What do you mean by safety? You know, what is it? Is it a social issue? Is it a mobility issue? Is it, you know, what is it? Okay. So what do you mean by, you know, I don't feel like you're treating me with respect. What do you mean by respect? Well, I don't think you're really hearing me. Oh, that's what you mean. So clarifying questions. You never, what do you mean by never? You always, what do you mean by always? So again, when you assume you know what someone means, the question is, no, I know what I think that word means. I know what it means to me. What does it mean to that person? An explaining question, again, in conflict, great context. An explaining question invites the person to explain to you their thinking. What leads you to that conclusion? What leads you to believe that that's a good option for addressing this problem? How did you come to that conclusion? Those are the kinds of questions. Explain to me how you got from A to B, because getting to A to B makes no sense to me, but when you explain how you got there, oh, now it makes sense to me. An exploring question is a question that's designed to really get at what's really important to somebody. It's really getting at their deeper interest. What is most important to you about having mom stay in her home versus considering having her in some other placement of some sort? What's most important to you around, this was a fun conversation. Mom no longer driving, those kinds of conversations. Okay. But one of my favorite questions is, what do you most need me to understand about the situation that you don't think I currently understand? I love that question. Okay. And then be ready to hear the answer and not argue with it. Okay. But be open to that. A challenging question is a question designed to confront inconsistencies in what someone is saying or dissonance in what they're saying. And so I might say, on the one hand, I heard you ask for this, and then a moment ago, I heard you just ask for this. I don't understand how those go together. As a mediator, I'll often hear people demanding things that are totally inconsistent. And I'm going, excuse me, on the one hand, I'm hearing you ask for this, and now I'm hearing you ask for this, and I'm not quite sure how they go together. Now, if you're of my generation, and if you want an image of the master of the challenging question, some of you know who I'm going to say, it was Lieutenant Columbo. If you ever remember that TV show, Lieutenant Columbo, it's like 5 minutes before the end of the episode, he's almost got and a challenging question is not a gotcha question. For him, it was a gotcha question. One more question. You said you weren't home on Tuesday night, but there were 10 phone calls from your phone. And so he's confronting, and that's inconsistencies in the guy's story. So this is not a got you question, but when you're hearing things, you're going, this is not making sense to me. Can you help me make sense of it? Brainstorming questions are pretty straightforward. Brainstorming questions are designed to generate options, potential solutions, courses of action, whatever they might be. Brainstorming questions are great. My biggest concern with brainstorming questions is we often ask them way too early in the conversation. Someone names the problem and someone starts brainstorming solutions. And I often say, whoa, time out. One, we haven't even agreed to talk about the problem. Two, we haven't agreed what the problem is, and yet we're already solving it. We need to slow down here. So slowing down to say before we start coming up with, and that is a strong propensity again within our organizational cultures. Give me a problem, give you a solution. Problem, solution. Let me fix that. No, and we generate a lot of solutions to problems that are never taken time to really fully unpack and understand. Consequential questions, again, would be questions you'd be asking more towards the end of a conversation where you're beginning to move towards maybe a decision or a course of action. And these are sometimes called reality testing questions. How is so-and-so going to respond to this issue? How is this going to impact such and such over here? What would be the consequences that we need to consider over here? Those are the kinds of things. How do you think mom's going to respond when we do that? Whatever. So hopefully, and again, we could use so much more time, you begin to see that questions can be used very intentionally. And when I say intentionally, I don't mean in a manipulative or coercive way. They can be used that way too. But in engaging conflict and integrity, they can be used very intentionally to dig deeper into what's going on, to really get at a deeper shared understanding, to really unpack, and to move from assumptions to getting at the deeper realities and facts that are driving that, okay? So questions on the art of asking questions and where it fits in this particular process. And again, at this point in the conversation, we're not just asking questions, we're asking questions, then we're reflecting back what we understand the answer to be, and then we're asking questions, and then we're summarizing. I mean, it's a much more fluid conversational structure where we're using our intentional inquiry skills and our active listening skills to really deepen our understanding. If we had more time, I could show you, just demonstrate how you can move very efficiently into a conversation to deeper understanding with just establishing more comfort with the kinds of questions we ask and why we ask them. Now, it's in some conflicts, in some difficult conversations, we end the conversation at the end of this conversation. It's like, we've been in conversations like, you know, that was helpful, thank you. I have a much better understanding of what's been going on. And I don't think, we don't need to make a decision. I just really appreciate this opportunity to talk this through with you and to sort of clear the air. And let's just maybe agree that should things surface in the future, let's agree we're going to talk about them, but we end the conversation. In some conversations where there needs to make where we need to make a decision, we'll often end the conversation here and say, you know, that's a lot of food for thought. I mean, that's been a great conversation. We just spent maybe an hour, hour and a half and going, you know, I just need to step back and process what I've heard. And again, beginning to recognize that, you know, people have differential needs for processing and reflecting on that. I think, you know, one of my favorite books I've read recently is Quiet by Susan Cain, which talks about being an extrovert living in or an introvert living in a world for extroverts, where, you know, some of us need time to step back and say, I need to just process this information. I was doing a mediation once where one of the lead people in one of the parties, and we'd been at the table for 8 hours. One of the people stood up in the middle of mediation and goes, that's it, you've poured as many words into my brain as I can possibly process. And she just walked out of the room. And I thought, yeah, that's kind of the way I'm feeling too. It was actually kind of funny. We may take a break in the conversation and say, let's let this sort of percolate, simmer, whatever word you want to use. Let's come back. But when we come back, there may be a need to develop some solutions for moving forward. And I think that does help. The main thing that I would add here, particularly when we're dealing with conflict, is if we're going to come up with a plan of what we're going to change, we need to generate options. We need to evaluate those options as to which one makes the most sense for us. And there's a whole process around that. And most of all, we need to make an agreement that has enough specificity involved in it, that has clarity, that really, whatever we agree to, and in some cases, you know, in my world, we got to write it down because it's actually a contract we're entering into that says what we're going to do. But I think it's important that particularly when we're engaged in conflict, what's often happens at this point in the conversation, people are feeling a lot better. It's like, whoa, that was a pretty good experience. I'm feeling good about this conversation. I think we had some great breakthroughs, you know, and they're feeling kind of good and going, yeah, we'll work out the details later. Well, who do we know is in the details? The devil's in the details. And so at some point, if we're going to come up with a plan, that plan has to have some specificity to it, which means it needs to answer the who, what, when, how, whatever, where, who, what, when, where, how, and what if kinds of questions. Okay, I agree to pay Marcy the $100 I owe her. Will Marcy like that agreement? No, because Marcy's going to know, that's fine, but when are you going to pay me? Well, I think I'll pay you 1 penny a year for the next 100 years. Does that work for you? She's going to probably go, no, I don't think so. Okay. So, you know, we need to work out the specificity. What are you going to do? When are you going to do it? Is there a where? Is there a how? If for some reason you're not able to agree with it, what are you going to do? But we need to bring specificity to that so that there's accountability. So that is, I think that didn't do too bad. Covers a lot of the process. And this is a fairly generic process, but I will say that the 4 stages: preparation, convening, conversation, insight to action is a model I use all the time. It's a basic structure of mediation. It's a basic structure of negotiation. It's a basic structure of group decision-making and group problem solving. There's variations on a theme throughout that, but it is a basic structure. So before and Kim, we're going to break into our breakout sessions here in a minute or two. Are there any questions on what I've shared so at this point in the
Greg,
conversation?
there's one in the chat, Greg. It says regarding asking
can.
questions. Oh, go ahead, Ren.
I can. So I often experience that I want to come and ask questions with curiosity, and in part because I present. I think there are dynamics around gender and age that factor into the question asking that can sometimes skew the direction the conversation goes, and so how do you, and then time is another factor. So I'm curious how you might guide people to ask questions but not lose the direction of the conversation or be unable to come back to a conclusion.
Well, I'm not sure if I'm understanding the whole question, so let me just try and let's see where this takes us. Yeah, and it's interesting. I've just been in some conversations in a forum recently around just some of the age and gender issues around asking questions and becoming very cognizant of some challenges there. And when I'm asking questions, I will sometimes ask permission to ask a question. I'm wondering, could I ask you some questions? Yeah, I'd like to unpack this a little bit more. And the purpose of my questions is really helping me to better understand and help us better understand. Would that be okay with you? So I'll often ask permission. As a mediator, if I go into a caucus with parties, I'm going to sometimes ask them some really hard questions, and I'll tell people, I'm going to ask you some really hard questions. And my hunch is that in some cases, my questions are going to push you outside your comfort zone. And actually, that's not my intent, but it is my intent because it really is to expand our understanding of the issues. And so if the questions don't land well with you, please let me know. Give me feedback, but that's what I'm committed to. So I will often start questioning by asking permission and even setting some expectations about how those questions might land and how to deal with that. So Ren, I'm not sure if that's getting at what you were talking about.
I guess this sounds, I feel so much self-conscious just saying this, but often when I start asking questions, I lose power and control, which is fine. But that then the conversation goes somewhere else and the hoped for end, and sometimes even the end that we've created the space to resolve goes away.
Got it. So sometimes I need to be aware. So here's a couple things I would say. Sometimes we need to lose that direction because it was the wrong direction. I had two situations where we spent significant time designing two meetings. They were all DA meetings for large state agencies. We spent all this time designing the meetings. They were all day. And we got halfway through each meeting, and halfway through each meeting, we realized we designed the wrong meeting because of what we learned. And so we had to say, okay, what are we going to do? And we went to our sponsor, and he said, if you need to change it, change it. So we shifted direction. I call that operating with emergent design, dealing with what shows up. So there are times when we ask the questions, we maybe realize where we started this conversation, we're learning is maybe not where it needs to go. And sometimes we need to just name that and reach agreement. What do you think? Do we need to make a shift in here? Or we might pursue a line of questioning, and I'm realizing, whoa, I think this question is kind of taking us on a tangent that may have relevance, but may not be the right time for that. So I might want to even name that and say, this is an interesting line of questions. I find it might be valuable. I'm wondering if maybe we can maybe pull back and move this in the direction, which requires me to be very conscious of where the conversation's going. Is that where the conversation needs to go? Or might I need to rein it back in and take it back in another direction? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's helpful.
I think I have to be really ready in some conversations to go, this conversation may take me in a direction I didn't anticipate. And if I'm open to learning, is that a loss of power? I'd say no. It's an access to learning and saying, whoa, this has opened up some avenues we weren't aware of. Let's talk about that. Do we need to And that may be a shared agreement. Is there agreement that maybe we need to make some shifts here and where this
I mean, like-
conversation is taking us? So
Would that be like renegotiating in conversation the
Yeah.
purpose of what you're trying to resolve? Or
yeah, and it might mean, we need to shift the conversation. We might say, we need to have a second conversation because we've just unpacked some issues that we didn't anticipate. So maybe we're going to agree that we're going to continue on the conversation we started, but we're also going to continue, we're going to agree to come back and pick up this new thread that we've identified as being significant. Or in some cases, we're going to say, no, we really can't continue on the conversation we're on because in fact, this other conversation is important for us to have to address the other one. So we're in essence, you are renegotiating in real time what's going on. You're not making that decision by yourself.
right,
If I'm facilitating, I'm not making that decision. I'm saying, how do we have a decision here? We've entered a choice point. We can go left, we can go right, we can go straight ahead. What do we need to do? We need to keep going straight ahead, but we're gonna have to come back to this juncture and go right because we're gonna have to follow that up. But it's about addressing time. Absolutely, time may be a factor. It's about addressing, priorities, what's most important. But it's being flexible enough in the conversation that as you are learning, you adjust based on that new learning. And there's a whole lot of factors that are determining that. We may be in a conversation where, yeah, that's an important issue, but we need to have a recommendation to so-and-so by such and such a time, and we need to stay on this conversation. So there's a whole number of factors that could be informing that.
Mhm.
So I'm going to ask Kim to put you into your breakout rooms. We're going to come back for about 10 minutes. And in your room, I'd like you to just reflect on the following questions. What in this session has resonated most with you? So as you've listened to these 4 sessions, maybe what's jumped out at you as being particularly relevant to where you are related to this topic right now? What, if any, new insights have you gained that are sort of ahas that are going, yeah, that's new information, that's helpful? And more importantly, what we know about learning something new changes nothing. You got to do something with it. So where might you apply some of the things that we've talked about in this session? So Kim, if we could take about 10 minutes to do that and then come back. And Kim, if you're open to this, I'm willing to stick around for a couple minutes after. If there's questions that people want to pose, I'd be glad to stick around for 10 or 15 minutes longer to address that, if that works for you. One second here, there we go. Okay. So I want to just open it up for any final questions, but I want to go back to Ren's question because actually I had a chance to read it, Ren. I'm not sure if you're still here. You may or may not be. Yeah,
I'm here.
okay.
Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry? Oh, yeah, okay, I see, there you are. Got it, thank you. Your question is, how do you balance time restraints with questions asking process? I think that was great. One, I think at some point we may need to say, there's a need for questions and there's not time for questions. Maybe we need to make a decision, recognizing it may be an interim decision that we're going to have to come back and revisit. I do think that when we're engaging complex issues, you just got to build time in for questions. It has to happen. And when we've got time constraints and we need to reverse engineer and saying, if we need a decision by now and we're here, how are we going to reverse engineer it to build time to ask the questions we need and to engage in the learning necessary? So in many cases, it becomes being proactive enough and anticipating that we're going to have to build that into the conversation in some way. So I hope that's maybe a little more entire. So let me just open it up. Jeff, I see a question up there. And Kim, let me just check. If we go a little longer, if people need to drop off, I get that. And I want to just say thank you for hanging out for 4 evenings to do this conversation, which I love to talk about. So thank you. I hope you found some value in it. If you need to drop off, I totally get that. And if you want to stick around, I'll stick around until Kim throws me off the site, whatever. So let's just go forward. Jeff, you got a question, I think, and then let me know if you've got questions, please. Shout it out if you have, because I can't see everybody at once.
Yeah, I found myself thinking about Ren's question also, and I wondered if part of the dynamic for her that might be helpful is what you talked about, Greg, about stepping out of the content and going into context. So if she's, I could imagine a scenario where, I mean, because I've gotten this, I get mothered and fathered by members of the church, and she's a little younger and she's newer in the parish, and so she's got kind of, I could easily see she's in curiosity exploration mode, and somebody begins to be shifting into fixing and solving and giving her advice, where she has maybe a perfectly good idea of where she wants to go or where the church needs to go. So I wondered if that were something of the scenario, Ren, that you might be wrestling with, and if perhaps, Greg, if that were the reality, might stepping into the context be something, or is there something else that might be helpful for her?
Yeah, I think the idea is there, and I'm not going to ask Ren to say, yeah, that's it or not it. I just think that there's a context where you're saying, can we just stop for a moment? Because, I really appreciate it. It sounds like in this conversation that you've got some ideas on where we need to go forward. And, right now, that's not what I need. And what I would really find helpful is if you could just sort of step back and let me, share my ideas and thoughts and reflect on that. And I'm really not looking for a solution right now. And while I appreciate the desire to do that, can we maybe not go there? And so I think there's a time to step back, and maybe what you're saying is to say, acknowledge what's going on, acknowledge the positive intent, and say, I need to ask for what I need right now. And what I don't need is a solution. And I recognize the way it's being offered, and that's not what I need right now. Could we talk about what I do need and whether that's going to work for you to have this conversation at this point? Does that begin to address what you're thinking, Jeff?
Yeah, I'm wondering, because I think it
Yeah,
happens.
absolutely.
Conversations go sideways on us, and how do we kind of move it in a different direction? So
yeah, and I think if the conversation is not working, let's not continue down that conversation, or let's not walk away from each other ticked off because it didn't work. Let's say, let's trust each other enough and care enough and saying, this conversation right now is not working for what I need in the conversation. How's that working for you? It's not working for me either. Well, what do we need to do? And I don't need to fix it. You don't need to fix it. The question is, if it's not serving us, let's structure it in a way that will serve us.
yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Are there any other questions anybody has that you want to throw out there?
Well, Judy and I were talking and saying how your techniques probably work well in a workplace, but sometimes if you got the difficult family, like you, Greg, are working with your sibs, but she and I had both been in situations, with her spouse and my mother, where you just have a dominating family member that knows everything. And how can you get them to engage in a process to discuss things?
Yeah, and I may not.
There's a lot of emotions involved with everybody.
Well, I'll be real honest with you. There's nothing magic in what I'm talking about. There's nothing that says if you learn these skills, every conversation you have will work effectively. I mean, I will say that in a number of different relationships where I've had a desire or hope for what that conversation would look like and what that relationship would look like, it didn't turn out that way. And so in some cases, I'm not fixing the other person, which I spent a lot of time trying to do that over the years, and I won't go into details on that, but with not a whole lot of success. But in some ways, it's about, I need to reflect on my response and my relationship to the situation. And there are times where I'm saying, I love this person, and what I want to have happen in this situation isn't going to happen. And so I'm going to adjust my expectations and realize that as much as I want this conversation to go forward, it may happen at some point. It's not going to happen now. And I can make myself crazy and the other person crazy and damage the relationship, or I can let go and give it to God and say, how can I learn to love this person who just really ticks me off, to be honest?
Yeah, okay.
I mean, I want to be honest about
Yeah.
that, but I think there are points where there's nothing magical about it. And there are situations where people are going, I just don't do life that way. I'm going, okay. Well, in some cases, we don't have a relationship any longer, but in some cases, you are family. We do have a relationship. And now I'm adjusting my expectations for who I'm going to be in that relationship and realize I have the choice to be who I'm going to be at integrity in this relationship. And I will not let that be determined by the other person. So I would step back from that.
Sometimes you just have to step back and let it go.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of conversations I'd like to have. I'm going, and I'm not going to have the conversation because I've actually done a cost. If you want to look at it from an economics, I've done a cost benefit analysis on this conversation. There's a whole lot of risk and no potential benefit. And I may want it as bad as I want it, but it is not going to happen right now. So I got to let go of that, or I'm going to drive everybody crazy. You know, and there are conversations I've been into are going, I need to step away from this conversation and create some space because it's not going to happen. And those are often with people I care deeply about and have to rethink that, but own responsibility for who am I going to be in that and adjust my expectations. So does that help?
Yes, well, that's good to know.
Yeah.
We're all human, and sometimes you just have to make those choices.
I have to tell you a quick story. When I was first learning mediation years ago, my son Nathan, who's an adult now, was 7 years old, and I came home one night from a training. He goes, Dad, what do you do? And I go, well, I'm a mediator. He goes, well, what's that? And I said, well, a mediator is someone who sits down, who are having conflicts and problems, and he helps them talk about it in ways that will be successful, where they can resolve the problem. And he looks at me, he goes, Dad, you may be pretty good at that at work, but you're not very good at that at home. I said, yeah, and you're the reason, you little twit. No.
Well, yeah, there's a power level there. He doesn't have the power.
I remind him of that story every once in a while. He's almost 40 now, so we all survived. Anything else that I can respond to? Well, I did check the handout. So you got the slides. There is a handout. If you didn't get it, check with Kim. Kim can check with me. There is a bibliography in there. So there are books you can, and you want any recommendations, you know, give me an email or whatever. I'd be glad to respond. But thank you so much. This has really been fun. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. You're
Thank you.
fabulous. Thanks so much.
Okay.